What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with DCKO, and we have a lot to catch up on. We are back from vacation, and we're getting the Flash versus Green Lantern, and it's the most powerful Flash has ever been. So, what this does is this picks up with Jay Garrick. Now, do not dismiss Jay. Jay Garrick is slept on. He's one of the best members of the Flash family. I like to call him Old Man Flash because that's basically what he is, but he says, my name is Jay Garrick, I'm still the Flash, and I'm angry, right? Guy Gardner says, my name is Guy Gardner, I'm a Green Lantern, the Green Lantern, in my opinion, and I'm pretty pissed off. Now, one of the things to keep in mind about Guy Gardner during the event of DCKO is that he's time displaced. This is Guy Gardner pulled from the past into the present day as part of the whole We Are Yesterday crossover from World's Finest and Justice League, right? But Jay Garrick says, my old lab at the university, this is where it happened. This is where I became what I am. This is the location the Heart of Apocalypse has chosen for our first round. Now, there's a couple things to know about Jay Garrick. Jay Garrick got his powers by way of heavy water. In fact, he's the original Flash as far as publication history goes in DC Comics, the first one to become the Flash. And so that's what he talks about when he talks about his old laboratory and how this is how he became what he was. But for those of you guys who need a bit of a refresher, the Heart of Apocalypse, right? Everyone is competing in order to gain the power of the Heart of Apocalypse so they can face Darkseid. And that's when the Heart chimes in. Jay Garrick, Guy Gardner, to advance, you will compete in a game of power. The champion must score 2 rounds out of 3. Choose your forms in later rounds to ensure victory. The only way forward is to fight. And that's where Jay says, Guy might be tough. And Guy says, this has been, should be cake. And so he just asks, right? He says, old timer, how are you feeling about all of this? And Jay just says, frankly, exhausted. And so that's where you kind of get Jay sort of chiming in, right? Crisis after crisis. I've got decades on Guy, decades of fighting, decades of loss. I bet that's why the Heart placed us here at the beginning of it all, like it never happened, like it never mattered. It's trying to get under my skin, but here's the benefit of being a Flash. When you can run through 10,000 scenarios in a nanosecond, evil is easy to outwit. And instead of initially fighting Guy, he stops him dead in his tracks and he just says, wait, right? And that's where Guy Gardner, right? Ever the headstrong and fiery tempered guy, he says, we haven't got all day. And that's where Jay just says, I mean, the Heart said a game. And that's where he proposes that the two of them play a game. He says, I know what's at stake, but let's be smart about this, right? We have to play by the Heart's rules, but we don't have to give it our souls. And he says, here, me and other research students used to play this when we were in a bind, stuck. And that's where he breaks out a checkers board. Now, here's the funny thing about Jay Garrick, right? You don't really get the same kind of scenarios with Jay that you do with like Wally West or Barry Allen. Right, wrong, or otherwise. Jay Garrick does have a lot of experience. And that's why when the two of them start playing checkers, Guy Gardner, because he's not the sharpest tool in the shed, although he is the guy you want in your corner when things start going sideways, we end up finding out that Guy Gardner doesn't know how to play checkers because literally he starts moving and Jay's like, you can't move there, right? And then like Guy goes to make another move and Jay's just like, you can't move there either. For God's sake, man, don't you know how to play checkers? And Guy Gardner just freaks out and just sends the board flying, right? He's like, so sue me if I don't know how to play your stupid old man game. And that's where Jay just says, Gardner, show some respect for someone who's been at it since before you were born. Not every fight has to be to the death. But here's the irony, right? Guy Gardner says, what world are you living in? Haven't you been paying attention? We don't play mumbledy-peg with gangsters and bank robbers anymore. It's a hard universe out there. Don't you get it? Now, that's the important thing about Jay Garrick. Jay Garrick comes from an era where superheroes fought bad guys, and superheroes beat bad guys, and bad guys went to jail. I don't say that to illustrate the fact that he's like naive. He doesn't really understand the world he lives in. It's really more to the point of Jay Garrick understanding that when he's facing off against an enemy, there's a lot more at stake than just defeating that guy. you can lose yourself, right? If you become too extreme and too hardcore, that's what happened to Superboy Prime during Infinite Crisis. Those of you guys who remember that story, Superboy Prime shows up in the DC universe, right? And he starts talking about how they're all anti-heroes now. They're not the heroes he grew up reading, that they've lost themselves. And in an attempt to bring them back, he loses himself, and he just becomes a straight up villain who probably dominates the superhero landscape in one of the greatest displays of power that any of us have ever seen. But that's where Guy Gardner chimes back in and he says, just do the world a favor and finally retire. You, Alan, the entire Jurassic Society, which is an amazing name for him. And he says if Wildcat had known when to call it quits, maybe he'd still be alive. Because keep in mind, Wildcat died recently in DC Comics. He's been out of the picture for a while, and that's where Jay has had enough, because he and Wildcat were exceedingly close friends. So when you start bringing his dead friend into the equation, that's when he starts to lash out. It's not a fit of rage. He's not losing himself. I mean, it is a fit of rage, but he's not losing himself here, right? He's just like, retire, huh? And then just immediately humbles Guy Gardner. And that's where Guy just says, right, he broke my nose. Grandpa broke my nose. And so Jay just starts running laps around him and he just says, sorry if checkers is too slow for you. Why don't we speed things up a bit? And he says, how about we just finish it? And takes out Jay Garrick on the spot. He kills him. Well, he kills Jay Garrick on the spot. And so at that moment, they're both resurrected. And the Heart of Apocalypse says, choose your next forms and prepare. And so Jay says, as angry as I am, I can't give in to this. I need to remember what I'm really made of. And that's where Guy chimes in. And if you notice, it's split between green and red. And he says, I just got stronger. I can feel it. I'm gonna kill this geezer. And he's like, screw green, I am going red. He turns into Red Lantern Guy Gardner. Now, for those of you guys who aren't familiar with this, right, who are kind of like, what in the world is going on here? You're new to DC, all that kind of stuff. During Jeff Johns' legendary run on Green Lantern, there came a point where Guy Gardner became a Red Lantern, overcome with rage, but then he eventually learns to control it. And then there's a point where he's wielding both a green and a Red Lantern ring. He was cracked in that story. Dude, that guy was so OP during Jeff Johns' run. It was insane how powerful he became. And so that's why he says, right, the original JSA headquarters. Maybe we can play some bridge this round, or how about some shuffleboard? And that's where you find out Jay Garrick is more powerful than he's ever been, because he says, careful Guy, a storm's brewing. And Guy just asks him, right, where are you at, old man? And Jay just says, I'm all around you, Guy, because I am the Speed Force. And he just says, I hit him again and again, even as I now feel the Speed Force in pain, suffering, and dying. Red Rage is not great at defense, Guy. And he says, through the Speed Force, I can sense Wally's distress, something in the past, but I cannot go to him now. I cannot forfeit this fight. So instead, I strike the red ring with nearly a century of my own pent-up rage, and I overload it, and I blow the thing to atoms, and literally incinerates Jay Garrick. This fight lasted every bit of 10 seconds, right? It was that fast, right? Jay Garrick killed him that quickly, which is nuts when you think about it. Now, to his statement about the idea that the Speed Force is dying, that's actually what is also happening right now in the Flash comic, which is what this is. This is Flash 28. And Flash 27, coming out of the events of Flash issue number 26, which we covered, and we need to cover number 27, basically Impulse and Wally West had gone into the past to try to defeat Darkseid when he initially fought the Justice League right before he formed the Absolute Universe. Of course, Darkseid saw it coming from a mile away and literally just smacked them into the time stream. And so you end up finding out that the Legion of Darkseid had done something in the past to change time, to change things. And now the Speed Force is in pain and seemingly dying because of it. The Speedsters are losing their connection to their speed, which is every Flash story ever. But the fact is, right, in this moment when Jay Garrick defeats Guy Gardner, Jay says air is full of emerald ash. Guy's still green in his soul, not red. he's a good man. That's an important distinction there, right? Just because Guy Gardner was wielding the Red Lantern ring does not mean that he had given himself over to its power. He was still in control. And he says, just a young soldier doing his duty like I used to be. I can feel the heart's dark strength surge in me, and it's frightening. I was a good man once. Because Jay Garrick is afraid he's going to lose himself in the midst of all of this. That's everyone's fear. It was Superman's concern. All the good guys are worried that the longer this fight goes on, the more they will lose themselves, because they have to walk the path of Darkseid in order to attain the Heart of Apocalypse. They have to show that they believe in the ideologies of Darkseid in order to win. And so that's where the Heart of Apocalypse chimes in for the third time and says, prepare for the final round. Choose your forms wisely. And at that point, we switch over to the Watchtower. Now, this is the kind of interlude that's been going on here, right? You have the Quantum Quorum, you've got Booster Gold, you have Gorilla Grodd, you have Time Trapper Doomsday, and you have the World Forger. But one of the things that we had learned is that Booster Gold has been possessed by the spirit of Darkseid and has actually taken out both the World Forger and Doomsday. And at this point, his sights are set on Gorilla Grodd. And that's the interesting thing, because we get this statement, who threatens us now? Who attacks the Quantum Quorum? Who are you? And that's where Booster, communicating with Grodd telepathically, says, I am no one and I am everything. Because Grodd doesn't know exactly what's going on here. And so he just says, whoever you are no match for my mind. You now face Gorilla Grodd. And that's where Darkseid just says, no quorum, no chaos, Time Trapper falls, the World Forger falls, Booster Gold falls. And so in response to that, Gorilla Grodd says, you're wrong, right? I believe Booster remains. I will find him, I will pierce your mind, and I will find him. And so when he launches a telepathic attack against Darkseid, it doesn't work, as you wouldn't expect it to. Darkseid is immensely powerful, right? Even if it's not Darkseid in his truest form, because keep in mind, Darkseid in his actual form, as he really exists, is seemingly out there in the absolute universe. We don't know the full totality of what's going on here, but we're kind of left to believe this is really more of like a facsimile or an avatar piece of Darkseid's consciousness, which has seized control of Booster. And literally what ends up going on is Grodd says, hear me, Booster Gold, I will free you. And Booster has no response because Darkseid has total control, and he just says, no, you hear me, Grodd, see my time, see your fate, and accept my end. Because when he shows Grodd what he wants to see happen, everyone's destroyed, tortured, mutilated, the whole 9 yards. All the superheroes are out of the picture. Crazy enough, they all look like the characters from Deceased. To be honest with you guys, right? When everybody became zombies, when they were infected with anti-life, that's literally what it looks like. But the crazy thing about this is that in this moment, and in fact, we'll end up getting this from Superman 33, in this moment, Lex Luthor picks up on the telepathic signal of Grodd, just enough to understand something is going on in the Justice League Watchtower. He doesn't get the full totality of it, but there is a moment where he picks up on something. And so at that point, you jump back to Jay Garrick and Guy Gardner. And Guy just says, what Jay said, respecting what came before, he is right. And it's not red or even green. It's not the Lantern Corps at all. What I truly am is a warrior. No more belly aching. This is what I was built for. And that's where he addresses Jay, and he says, welcome to Voldar, Jay Garrick. You're on my turf now. So here's the thing. Sidetrack from the story for a second. Let's talk about Bo's run on Guy Gardner, Warrior. Here's the thing. This is one of these stories that is very divisive when it comes to the fan base. Either people love it or people hate it. There are people that swear it's one of the worst eras in Guy Gardner's history in the entirety of DC Comics. And there are people who will not hear a word against it. The sun rises and sets on this particular comic book. But the idea behind it goes like this. Guy Gardner Warrior came out in 1994. Most of you guys are aware of the story Emerald Twilight, where Hal Jordan goes crazy, he declares himself Parallax, he destroys the Green Lantern Corps Central Battery, and basically takes out all the other members of the Lantern Corps. This leaves Kyle Rayner as the sole Green Lantern. The issue is this, DC was looking to relaunch the Green Lantern mythos. They basically wanted to remove everybody outside of Kyle Rayner. At that point in time, Guy Gardner wasn't really a Green Lantern. He was running around with Sinestro's ring, but he was still part of the Lantern mythos nonetheless. So what DC ended up doing is they wrote this whole mythos establishing that Guy Gardner was actually from a whole different planet, and he had this kind of alien physiology that basically gave him like enhanced strength and speed and durability, different things like that. He could turn his arms into cannons, and then what ends up happening is that when everything gets restored, right, so you go into like Green Lantern 150, you eventually go into Jeff Johns' run, all that is kind of removed. Not in the sense that DC writes it out of existence, but in the sense that it's just kind of no longer a part of his character mythos. So in a lot of ways, it's kind of like the comic book narrative equivalent of just letting your voice trail off. Like, Guy Gardner is warrior, and he can do some stuff, and like, that's it. That's really all it is. He just kind of goes back to being a Green Lantern. You hadn't really seen or heard from it for quite some time, until now, because Jay Garrick chimes in and he says, it's time to let the anger go. It's time to start with the beginning, with my clearest mind, when my sole goal was to wage war against evil and win. And that's why he says, swell planet, Guy, shame you'll have to die on it, but it's for the greater good. And the two of them start going at it. And Guy Gardner's literally turning his arms into different weapons, which is really dope to see this return. This is one of those times when I didn't realize how awesome the concept was until it was utilized properly, which is kind of what you get here, because Guy Gardner says, you don't get it, do you, Garrick? Right? He says, I took your advice, that it's not just me that you are up against. It's the entire lineage of my Voldarian ancestors, an endless army of warriors dating back eons. And he says, so please, have some respect for my elders. And he just like turns his arms into cannons and fires them off against Jay. But right before he does, because they haven't lost themselves here, Jay says, Guy, do me one favor. And Guy just says, no mercy, Garrick. And Jay says, I don't need it, right? Just beat the tar out of Darkseid for me. And Jay just says, you got it, pal. And fires off a rocket and blows Jay Garrick to bits. And that is how Guy Gardner wins. And so at that point, you jump over to Central City and you actually end up picking up with Iris, right? She says yes, right? He's engaged. He's a forensic scientist. We met at a crime scene I was reporting on, of all things. Took him a while to ask, but the man is always dragging his feet. And she says, he's so sweet, like almost cornball sweet. You'll love him. And that's where there's a knock at the door. And she just says, hold on, right? Somebody's here. I'll call you tomorrow. And so she goes to answer this door only to find that Wally West is there, picking up after the events of issue number 27, when Impulse, Bart Allen, has seemingly lost his connection to the Speed Force. And initially he addresses her as his aunt, but then he realizes because time has been changed, she doesn't know who he is. And so he just says, Miss West, right? I've read your work in the paper and we are distant cousins, both of us. And he says, I can't fake this. There's no time. Iris, you have to listen to me. This boy, I need you to watch over him. And she's just like, why? Why in the world, right? To a degree, it's a kind of repeat of Wally West's own history when it comes to Iris, because he's not her actual son, right? They're related, but he was kind of dropped off on her doorstep, so to speak. And so that's why he says, I'm about to face some very bad people, and he is in no condition to come with me. And so she asks, who are you? And he just says, he just needs some rest, maybe some food. I will be back soon, I promise. Please trust me. And where initially she protests, right? You can't just leave him. The response of Wally is to say, I'm sorry, Barry Allen is in grave danger and I have to help him. And so basically races off, because as things stand right now within the Flash comics, Barry Allen's powerless. He doesn't have his abilities. So with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. If you did, drop a like. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.